Joining us now is Rishi Sunak, who's Chief Secretary to the Treasury. Hello to you, thanks for joining us.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon. So we heard from the Chancellor, there's more money in the pot than ever we thought possible. Free chocolate on Fridays and everything.
Maybe not quite free chocolate, though that would be very good. No, it's a significant increase in public spending. You're absolutely right. The largest increase in day-to-day spending in almost 15 years, with the priorities being schools, the NHS and keeping people safe with 20,000 police officers. Important. No department across government will see a cut in its funding. That's the first time that's also happened in that period of time. And these increase in spending will be delivered responsibly within our fiscal rules, which is incredibly important as well. So I think a very good day, and one that viewers will welcome warmly, I hope.
Where's all the money coming from?
Well, as I talked about, delivering this within our fiscal rules ensures that we are being responsible because of the careful management of the economy over the past several years. We got to a point last year where our borrowing, what we were borrowing every year, was down to the lowest in 20 years. When the OBR, the independent forecaster, last reported, they talked about us having the headroom for more public spending. We have used that today and invested in our public services, but as I said, doing it within the fiscal framework to make sure that it is sustainable and responsible, yet delivering, as I said, on the people's priorities with NHS, schools and more police.
Are you saying that you're not breaking the fiscal rules?
That's absolutely right. What we've announced today, it can take place within the fiscal rules. It is compliant with those, and that's why, as I said, it's important that whilst we do increase public spending on people's priorities, we have to do it in a responsible manner, and that's what we have done today.
But you are breaking the fiscal rules, aren't you? At least not, as far as by the time the OBR has updated its numbers, you'll be breaking the fiscal rules.
Well, the OBR forecasts that we're working to are the ones that we're working to, that were published in March. That's all that we have available, and we are compliant with those forecasts and have delivered this spending review within those forecasts and within the fiscal framework. I can't speculate on what might happen at the future. The Chancellor has said that he wants to revisit the overall fiscal framework in any case. What we have seen is a record low interest rates in this country, and the Chancellor has talked about using that opportunity potentially to invest in our infrastructure, take advantage of those low interest rates, and that's something that he and the Prime Minister are actively considering. That infrastructure will help leaven up every part of our country. I'm a Northern MP, it's something I welcome, connecting up northern cities, for example, and the Chancellor said he will have a look at that, look at our fiscal framework and see whatever the new set of forecasts are when we have a budget later this autumn.
So can you just clarify, will you be changing the spending plans when the OBR updates its numbers, if you are no longer within those fiscal rules? Will you change your spending plans then?
No, these spending plans are fixed for 2020-21, the next financial year. The fiscal framework is something that the Chancellor has said he will actively review between now and the budget, particularly with a focus on whether we should be doing something differently around infrastructure investment to take advantage of these record low interest rates, as many people are telling us we should do. And that will help drive up growth in this country, drive up wages and make sure that every part of our country benefits in that growth and in that prosperity. Infrastructure is a crucial part of that equation, and the Chancellor will come out with a plan for that later this autumn.
Okay, so I get that. So if you're not going to change your spending plans in order to fall into line with those new figures from the OBR as and when they come out, you're going to change the fiscal rules in order to fit your spending plans?
I think you're speculating on what might be in the future. We've made sure that we've delivered this significant investment, within the fiscal framework to make sure that it is responsible. I can't speculate on what the future forecast, the future situation might be. The Prime Minister has, as I said, committed to reviewing the framework. But it's important to remember that we will always be a government that cares about having control of our debt, having control of our public finances. That's important for our credibility. It's important for our general economic stewardship and management. That's what we do, that's what we want. It's because of that management that we so prize that we are now seeing record labour market, more people in work than ever before, low unemployment, wages rising.
Yeah, absolutely. We get all that. But
they happen
with respect, if I may, with respect, you're talking about fiscal probity. You are literally making a nonsense of the fiscal rules, aren't you? Surely.
No, the fiscal rules are relatively clear, the forecasts are relatively clear, and this spending review has taken place within those fiscal rules. And those fiscal rules are only anyway for 1 more year. So for the right here, right now, those are the rules we have. It's right that we are compliant with them, which we are. And as we get into the future, we need a new fiscal framework. And the Chancellor has said very clearly that he will look at that when we come to a new budget, because these rules run out anyway going into next year.
So what's the point? What's the point in having them if you change them when it doesn't suit you?
It's not about changing them when it doesn't suit you. It's about making sure that our fiscal framework overall is appropriate for the time that we're living in. So when we came into office in 2010, we were staring down the barrel of borrowing £1 in every 4, £150 billion a year that we were borrowing. That was incredibly serious and meant that we had to make some difficult decisions and have a particular control over the public finances in one way. As we are now, where borrowing last year was at an almost 20-year low, interest rates have changed over that time frame in quite a significant way. It would be the prudent thing economically to re-examine whether the fiscal framework that we had, which anyway runs out next year, is appropriate and what is the right fiscal framework going forward. As I said, there is a big significant change with interest rates that provokes a question about the right level of infrastructure investment, and that's exactly what the Chancellor is doing.
Just to clarify, you don't think that you are throwing away your reputation for fiscal probity by issuing this spending review and the massive increase that we have seen? You think that is going to be within the rules?
Absolutely, and if I didn't care about fiscal probity or fiscal responsibility, we clearly could spend hundreds of billions of pounds more, right? But that's not what we're doing, because we think that's not the right thing to do. It's not a good use of people's money. It wouldn't be the responsible thing to do. That's what happened in 2010. We saw how that story ended. We saw how it ended for countries like Greece, which then had to make devastating cuts to their public services as a result of being in that situation. We don't want to be in that situation, which is why there will always be careful stewardship of public finances with a Conservative government, and that's just one part of it. It's also about your relationship with business, making sure you support free enterprise, having a tax system that encourages hard work, rewards people for that, and having a labour market that is vibrant and putting money in people's pockets. All of those ingredients go into our reputation for economic competence, and I'm very confident that that reputation is intact today, yet enhanced by our investment in people's priorities, more money for schools, more money for the NHS, and more money for police to keep people safe.
Let me ask you this. Are you comfortable with spending more than Gordon Brown did for much of his time in office?
I can't hear you fully. What I can say is this increase in spending is the greatest increase in spending.
No, if I may, I'll ask you the question again and then you can hear it. I'm asking you, are you comfortable increasing spending more than Gordon Brown did for much of his time in office?
Well, given the trajectory, this is a very significant increase, which we haven't seen since 2015. So I'm fully saying that is absolutely the case. In terms of the total level of public spending, the size of the state, the size of public spending, what you are seeing is that has ticked up slightly, but is very much in line with the average of what you've seen over historic governments. And it is now, the crucial thing now is that level of public spending is sensible because it is being done not by borrowing £150 billion, but being done within the fiscal framework, which is a sustainable and responsible investment. But I make no excuses for the fact that today we are announcing a significant investment in public spending on people's priorities. It is the largest increase in public spending in 15 years, going back to around the early 2000s. And I said that the priorities for that are police, are the NHS, are schools, and indeed actually local government as well, our local councils.
Yeah, more borrowing, more debt. That's how you're going to pay for it though, isn't it?
Actually, debt, as I've said, this is, I know we keep having the same conversation, this spending review is being delivered within the fiscal rules, which means debt is falling, and indeed, within the borrowing requirement is also met. So it is being delivered responsibly within the fiscal framework.
Forgive me, because obviously you know how the figures work and I don't, which is why we're going over them time and time again in the hope that our viewers will be able to understand it as well. More debt is what we're talking about, more borrowing. How are you going? That is how you're going to be paying for this increase. Is that correct or not?
So, no, debt is falling in this year, and that is one of the fiscal rules. And the borrowing requirement, or the borrowing fiscal rule we have, is that borrowing should be...
Yeah, but in cash terms, debt is rising, isn't it? In cash terms, debt is rising.
but what we focus on is debt as a percentage of GDP, because our GDP is also rising, and all debt targets are done in a percentage of GDP, and as a percentage of GDP, debt is falling. You have to relate the size of the debt to the size of the economy. That's the right, appropriate, and that is indeed our rule. So that is being met, debt is falling, and our borrowing requirement every year, the debt rule around that is that it should be less than 2%, which indeed it is. And last year, as I said, borrowing, that annual amount that we're borrowing is the lowest in almost 20 years, which is why we're in this position now where we can increase public spending significantly whilst remaining within that fiscal framework.
Okay, just tell me what's happening as far as the Ministry of Defence is concerned, if you would. New money for the MOD, I'm being told, but given that most defence equipment contracts are done in US dollars, how much will, and this is from our defence correspondent, how much will the rise just cover the falling pound as a result of no deal fears?
No, there's a real terms increase for the Ministry of Defence. There's £2.2 billion of incremental funding available over this year and next year for the MOD to make sure they can continue investing in their priorities, especially around shipbuilding is one of them that the Prime Minister's talked about, the Defence Secretary's talked about. Also our NATO commitment that our 2% of GDP, we are one of the few countries in NATO that meet that commitment. Obviously NATO make the final calculations, but as a percentage of GDP, what we spend on defence, we estimate will go up as a result of what we've done today. And as I said, we remain the second largest investor in our armed forces within the NATO group. So I think a strong investment in the defence budget today of £2.2 billion.
But the point being from Alistair Bunkle is that given we have found ourselves in the position that we have, there could be serious problems with the pound versus the US dollar, and given that most contracts are done in US dollars, does that not mean that most of the money that you have pledged will be soaked up by that? The exchange
No,
rate?
that's absolutely, that's not the case. The money that we've put in will make sure that the MOD can invest in their new priorities, and all their priority programmes will get this extra investment. And with regard, it wouldn't be right for me to speculate on how individual contracts may or may not be structured with regard to FX rates and hedging strategies and everything else, but the Ministry of Defence are happy that this is an incremental investment for them, which will allow them to continue delivering on their priorities as set out in the previous Strategic Defence and Security Review.
Okay, and just while we've got you, we're almost out of time. Carbon emissions. You said that you would do whatever it took to eliminate carbon emissions, however much it cost. How much are you pledging?
Well, so our decarbonisation strategy, as you mentioned, we are the first government to put that in law. It's something we're proud of and we intend to deliver. What you've seen today is a range of announcements in today's spending review around air quality, biodiversity, and indeed exactly the agenda that you said, getting us to net zero decarbonisation. There's 30 million for all of those three things I just mentioned. I think the big news on decarbonisation is more a question for capital budgets. It's kind of investment in capital and infrastructure. That wasn't something that today's spending review deals with, because it was about our day-to-day spending. But the Chancellor's been very clear that we will come back to capital in the autumn, and that's where his ambitious visions for what we should be investing in infrastructure and capital will come into play, and net zero and science and R&D will be a big part of that, alongside what people traditionally think of as infrastructure, road and rail, and of course broadband. So all of that will be part of our capital review, which I think will be a very ambitious statement of intent, and that will be coming in the autumn.
It's good to talk to you. Thanks for joining us on the